We often talk about these grand historical shifts, right? But sometimes it's actually a single moment, a really vivid personal experience that can be the spark for massive change.
Absolutely.
So today we're doing a deep dive into Zionism. It's this remarkable movement, and its origins, its impact, well, they continue to resonate across the globe even now.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. And our mission here is simple. We want to unpack the source material you've provided, pull out the most important insights so you walk away truly well-informed. We'll dig into why this movement even began, the hopes and dreams of its founders, the massive challenges it faced, and how its outcomes, well, they're still shaping our world today.
And it's fascinating how it often traces back to specific moments, like that one in 1895, right, in Paris, Paris, City of Lights, but at that time overshadowed by this growing hatred.
A palpable sense of unease, yeah.
Definitely, you could feel it.
And right at the heart of that tension was the Dreyfus Affair. I mean, you have to picture this scene.
Yeah.
A young Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, publicly disgraced, stripped of his rank, accused of treason spying for Germany, allegedly.
And he denied it vehemently.
Vehemently denied it.
Yeah.
But the crowds were just shouting, full of anger. The source material describes the look on his face, just utter despair. It's a really haunting image. Sticks with you.
And watching all this unfold was Theodor Herzl. He was an Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist visiting from Vienna.
Right.
Now, Herzl, up to this point, he'd really believed in equality and assimilation. He was convinced that Jews could, fit into European society, that anti-Semitism was maybe a thing of the past.
A relic.
Exactly. But seeing this public spectacle of hatred, injustice, it just completely shattered that worldview for him. It became this image that haunted him apparently for life. He realized that even in France, the supposed land of liberty, equality, fraternity, this deep-seated anti-Semitism was just entrenched everywhere at all levels.
So that experience, that visual, it forced him to fundamentally rethink everything. What was the radical conclusion he reached, the one that really kick-started this whole movement?
Well, he concluded that if assimilation wasn't the answer, if Jews couldn't actually be safe even in places like France, then they needed a home of their own. Simple as that. A place to escape this hatred that seemed to follow them everywhere.
A safe haven.
Precisely. And that idea, that conclusion, that was the genesis, the start of something that would, as we know, completely transform the Middle East, spark this major movement, huge struggles, and ultimately lead to a new state.
That's such a powerful intellectual leap born from such a visceral experience. Now, if we zoom out a bit, 19th century Europe, the whole idea of the modern nation state was really taking hold then, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Nationalism was flourishing everywhere.
So was Herzl's idea totally unique, or were there sort of parallel things happening within the Jewish community already?
It wasn't entirely in a vacuum. There were earlier Jewish movements known as Hovi Zion, which literally means lovers of Zion.
Hibbet Zion, yeah.
Hibbet Zion, exactly. These groups were already kind of emerging with a similar goal. They weren't just passively waiting for a Messiah to take them back. They were actively trying to, build nation themselves. Yeah. Practical efforts.
And at the same time, in Western Europe, places like Germany, France, Italy, Jews were actually doing quite well in many ways.
Yeah, achieving significant economic success, getting into universities, excelling in professions, law, medicine, academia.
They were integrating.
They were trying. Their aspiration was definitely to gain acceptance, to be seen as equals within those European societies.
But here's the really chilling part, the paradox you mentioned. Despite all these efforts to assimilate, to succeed, anti-Jewish sentiment didn't just fade away. It actually increased rapidly.
It's profoundly disturbing. It wasn't just the old religious prejudice, though that was still there. Definitely that centuries-old Christian idea, blaming Jews for Christ's death. That got kind of intensified in the 19th century.
Right.
But what was new and really sinister was the spread of these pseudo-scientific racial theories. Yeah. These ideas didn't just paint Jews as a religious minority, but as a separate, inferior race, genetically different.
And we know where that led. Hitler later picked up those exact ideas.
Chillingly, yes.
And it wasn't just race or religion fueling it, was it? There was economic resentment, too.
Definitely. The success some Jews were having, their upward mobility, it bred resentment among parts of the working class majority. It was, as you said earlier, a perfect storm of prejudice.
So while Herzl is wrestling with this in Paris and Vienna, what was happening further east in Tsarist Russia, the situation there sounds even worse.
Oh, far worse. Brutal, really. In the early 1880s, Jews were treated officially as second-class citizens. Severe restrictions on everything where they could live, work.
And then came a catalyst.
Yes, the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in St. Petersburg in 1881. Rumors flew around, true or not, didn't matter, blaming Jews.
Oh, no.
And that sparked these horrific, widespread anti-Jewish riots, pogroms, across the Russian Empire.
The source material mentions looting, destruction, violence, murder. The Kiev pogrom of 1881 specifically, just awful.
Truly awful. And the official response, the new Tsar, Alexander III, basically blamed revolutionaries and Jews.
Doubling down.
Exactly. He issued these really strict anti-Jewish laws in May 1882, and that just triggered a massive wave of Jews leaving Russia, emigration on a huge scale.
So you have this intense oppression, this violence,
Yeah.
and then, as Professor Michael Berkowitz points out in the sources, this desire for cultural revival, too.
Yes, those twin factors, persecution pushing them out, and this internal drive for, a renaissance of Jewish culture and identity, pulling them towards something else.
Towards their own state.
It became the conviction. For Herzl, for other Zionist leaders, it seemed like the only way. A self-governing Jewish state was the only path they could see to safety, to survival.
Which brings us to that pivotal event, the First Zionist Congress. Basel, Switzerland, August 29th, 1897.
A truly historic gathering.
Imagine it. Jews from all over North Africa, America, Europe, different languages, different cultures, but united by this shared identity, this shared goal.
Must have been electric. But was everyone actually on board with this radical idea of a state? Was there consensus?
Oh, not at all. Far from it. There was significant internal opposition. A lot of European Jews, especially many Orthodox rabbis, were fiercely against Zionism.
Why was that?
They saw it as a religious affront, like humans trying to force God's hand, trying to return to Israel before the Messiah came, challenging divine will.
Interesting.
Yeah, in fact, the source notes the Congress was originally planned for Munich, but the local Jewish community there actually rejected it. They didn't want to be associated with the movement.
Wow, so even getting a venue was a challenge.
Right, but despite all that opposition, Herzl, described as elegant, suit, top hat, stepped up to the podium.
And what does he say? What's the core message that cuts through the dissent?
He says, and the source quotes this, "We want to lay the cornerstone for a safe home for the Jewish people." Simple, powerful.
And that resonated.
Apparently, it ignited hope, galvanized people, even with all the disagreements swirling around.
And that Congress, that moment, that's really the official start of political Zionism as a major force.
The first concrete step, leading eventually 51 years later to the State of Israel. The Zionist organization was formally set up there, later renamed the World Zionist Organization in 1960.
And the key goal they defined, not just settlement, but something more.
Exactly. The crucial thing decided was the need for a publicly recognized and legally protected home for Jews in Palestine. That's what set this political Zionism apart from those earlier, maybe more settlement-focused movements like Hevet Zion. It was about legitimacy, international backing.
And Herzl himself had this almost prophetic sense about it, didn't he? That diary entry.
Oh, yeah, it's quite amazing. Right after the Congress, he writes privately, "In Basel, I founded the Jewish state."
Bold.
Very. He adds that if he'd said it out loud then, people would have laughed at him. But he predicted, in 5 years or 50 years, everyone will know it.
And he was off by only 1 year, 51 years later. Incredible foresight.
It really is. So with that mission defined, the organization starts building structures, right? Practical steps.
Immediately, they set up things like the Jewish Colonial Fund money to support immigration to Palestine, help build up the economy there.
And it wasn't just one single approach, was it? The movement had different strands.
Right. That's important. You had the political wing focusing on diplomacy, legal recognition, but you also had the practical Zionists who were maybe more focused on quietly getting people there, building communities on the ground, sometimes covertly.
And later, other groups emerged too.
Over time, yes. At subsequent congresses, you see the development of labor Zionism, dreaming of those collective farms, the Klubbitzim. And then more radical factions appeared later on, like the revisionists under Vladimir Jabotinsky.
They had a different vision.
A more maximalist one, yeah. Advocating for a larger territory, more assertive methods, Jabotinsky co-founded the Irgun Group. And even further right, you had figures like Abraham Stern, co-founding Leahy, the Stern Gang. So a whole spectrum of ideas on how to achieve the goal.
Okay, let's rewind slightly. Before that first Congress, Herzl actually visited Palestine briefly, didn't he, in 1895?
He did, for about 10 days. And he saw firsthand that there were hundreds of thousands of Arabs already living there.
And his private writings from that time, they're quite revealing.
They are. He was already thinking about the future Jewish state, even talking about building a protective wall against what he termed the barbarism of people from Europe and Asia, and crucially, how to manage the existing indigenous population.
So awareness of the Arab population was there from early on.
It was. And interestingly, about a year after Herzl's visit, he got a letter. It was from Yusuf Akar, the former Arab mayor of Jerusalem.
What did Akar say?
He acknowledged Jewish suffering, their ancient connection to the land, but he gave a pretty clear warning. The local Arab inhabitants would not welcome Herzl's political ideas.
How did Herzl respond to that?
He wrote back, trying to be reassuring, said, Jews have no military power, they aren't warlike. He promised Arabs wouldn't be expelled and that they'd actually benefit from Western technology. Their lives would improve.
So diplomacy and reassurance on one hand, but also laying the financial groundwork on the other. That Second Congress in 1898.
Yeah, they formalized plans for that Jewish colonial fund and set up the first Zionist bank, the Jewish Colonial Trust. Got it legally registered in London in 1899.
Did they raise much money initially?
Not as much as they'd hoped, apparently. The initial fundraising fell short of the ambitious target. But as the source mentions, crucial support would come later, especially from people like the Rothschild family.
Now, Herzl himself, people described him as quite a presence.
Very charismatic by all accounts. Descriptions mention him looking like an Assyrian king, great speaker, exceptional rhetoric.
But despite that charm, when he invited wealthy, established Jews from America, England, France to that first Congress,
they largely turned him down, rejected the invitations.
why?
Because they saw themselves as citizens of their countries, French, American, British citizens who happened to be Jewish. They didn't identify as members of a separate Jewish nationality in the way Herzl was proposing.
So the irony is, the people who did come, who formed the majority at that first Congress,
Were the persecuted Jews from Russia. The very people Herzl, the affluent Viennese intellectual, hadn't initially expected to be his main base. He'd hoped for the Western elite, but it was the quote-unquote poor Russian Jews, though many were actually middle-class professionals who really embraced the message.
a surprising turn for him, I bet.
Must have been, but he kept going, convened 12 congresses in total, showed incredible dedication. At the Third Congress, 1899, he reported meeting Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany.
A big deal, symbolically.
Huge symbolic recognition for the movement. Then he later met the Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Hamid II.
And made him an offer.
A bold one. Offered to use Jewish finance to pay off the entire Ottoman Empire's debts in exchange for letting Jews settle in Palestine under some kind of charter.
What did the Sultan say?
Famously refused. Said something like, the land belonged to the people, bought with their blood, and couldn't be sold.
So doors were closing diplomatically in the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
Which led Herzl to consider other options.
Exactly. Faced with these rejections and feeling the urgency, the need for some immediate refuge, he started talking with the British Empire about possibly setting up a Jewish settlement in British East Africa, what's now part of Uganda.
Uganda. Not Palestine.
He presented it as a temporary solution, a night asylum, at the Sixth Zionist Congress in 1903.
How did that go down?
Terribly. It was vehemently rejected, especially by the Russian Zionists. They felt utterly betrayed. For them, it was Palestine, the ancestral promised land, or nothing.
So even Herzl's temporary tactical move backfired internally.
It did. Though, to be fair, at the end of that same meeting, Herzl strongly reaffirmed his commitment to Jerusalem, to Zion. But the Uganda proposal showed the desperation and the internal divisions.
But while Herzl faced these diplomatic setbacks, there was other, quieter work happening. You mentioned the Rothschilds earlier.
Yes, crucial involvement there. Particularly Baron Edmund James de Rothschild. Starting way back in 1882, he began buying land in Palestine, pouring money into infrastructure roads, factories, irrigation, even starting a wine industry.
Supporting those early agricultural communities, too.
Absolutely, the kibbutzim. And then there was Lord Walter Rothschild, a different branch of the family who was absolutely vital later in pushing for the Balfour Declaration.
So their influence was key.
Indispensable, really, both financially and politically. It's noted that not all branches of the family were fully on board with Zionism, but the support they did provide was critical.
And Herzl himself. Tragically, he didn't live to see his ultimate vision realized.
No, his health failed. He died suddenly of heart failure in 1904, only 44 years old. Never saw the state of his health.
But he left behind that novel, Old New Land,
Right.
published in 1902.
Right, and it depicted this really idealistic future Palestine. Jews and Arabs living together peacefully, this new society, no borders, no army.
A utopian vision.
Completely. And sadly, a vision that stands in such stark contrast to how things actually unfolded, the conflict-ridden path statehood eventually took.
Okay, so Herzl passes away, but the movement continues, and then World War I changes everything.
Dramatically. In 1917, two huge things happen. British forces captured Jerusalem from the Ottomans.
Right.
And in the same year, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, issues the Balfour Declaration.
With strong backing from Lord Walter Rothschild, as you said.
Exactly, declaring British support for establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine.
But, and this is crucial, hadn't the British promised something similar to the Arabs?
They had. A prior promise to King Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, support for an independent Arab state if he helped them fight the Ottomans.
And Britain just went back on that promise.
They did, reneged on the promise to the Arabs, which understandably led to this deep, lasting sense of betrayal on the Arab side.
So after the war, Britain gets control of Palestine under the Mandate system.
Correct. And they lift the old Ottoman restrictions on Jewish immigration and actually start actively encouraging Jewish settlement.
And immigration patterns shift too. America had been a major destination.
It had, especially before 1924. But then the U.S. brought in stricter immigration policies. Our source mentions fears of Jewish communism after the Russian Revolution playing a role.
So that effectively closed off the main alternative route for many European Jews.
Pretty much. It redirected the flow. More and more Jewish immigrants now headed towards Palestine, which aligned perfectly, of course, with the Zionist goal of returning to the Promised Land.
Then come the 1930s, Hitler's rise in Germany.
A chilling escalation. Harsh anti-Jewish laws spread across Germany, Poland, Hungary.
And finding refuge became harder and harder.
Extremely difficult. Very few countries were willing to take in Jewish refugees. So Palestine became less of a choice, less of a potential refuge.
And more of an absolute necessity.
Exactly. It became the place of survival. Mass immigration surged. The Jewish population in Palestine actually doubled just between 1932 and 1936.
And as the Jewish population grows, tensions with the existing Arab population must have skyrocketed.
Inevitably. Resistance from the Arab inhabitants grew stronger, and this escalating tension led to the formation or strengthening of these armed Jewish underground groups.
You mentioned some earlier, Haganah.
Haganah was kind of the mainstream, primarily defensive group formed to protect Jewish settlements and communities.
But there were more militant ones, too.
Yes. Irgun, the right-wing revisionist paramilitary group linked to Jabotinsky. They formed after World War I but became more active, engaging in attacks against both the British and Palestinians.
And Lehi, the Stern Gang.
Even more radical, more violent. Founded by Abraham Stern in 1940, known for infamous actions like the King David Hotel bombing against the British in 46 and the attack on Palestinian Arabs in Deir Yassin in 48.
But it's important to remember, not all Zionists supported this violence.
Absolutely not. There were deep divisions. Liberal Zionists, many among the old Jews who'd been there longer, still believed in peaceful coexistence, or hoped for it. But this new wave, the new Jews, especially those right-wing revisionists, were pushing for much harder lines, including, for some, the expulsion of Palestinians.
So you have these internal debates, armed groups, rising tensions, all building up. And then comes the ultimate horrific catalyst, World War II and the Holocaust.
The undeniable turning point. As the war raged, escape from Europe became virtually impossible for Jews. And the scale of the Nazi genocide, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the displacement of hundreds of thousands more.
It must have just galvanized international opinion.
It served as the most brutal, undeniable proof to the world that Jews had no safe haven. It dramatically accelerated international sympathy, the sense that a Jewish state was now an absolute imperative.
The source mentions testimony from Professor Anita Shapira.
Yes, a Holocaust survivor. Her parents were killed. She moved to Palestine in 1947 with her adoptive family and said it was the only place she felt safe being among other Jews. A powerful personal perspective on that need for sanctuary.
So after the war, the British basically overwhelmed by the conflict.
They hand the problem over to the newly formed United Nations in 1947.
And the UN comes up with the partition plan.
Correct. The UN votes to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. The Jewish state was allocated about 55% of the land.
How was that received?
The Zionist leadership, though not entirely happy, some hardliners wanted all the land. They reluctantly accepted the UN decision.
But the Arab side?
Rejected it completely. The Arab states, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, and the Palestinians themselves. Their argument, basically, was why should they have to pay the price, give up their land, for atrocities committed against Jews in Europe?
A fundamental disagreement right there.
Yeah.
Which leads to
May 14th, 1948. David Ben-Gurion, soon to be the first prime minister, stands up and declares the birth of the State of Israel, a hugely historic moment.
and the reaction from neighboring Arab states.
Immediate attack. The very next day, they launched an invasion. That's the start of what Israelis call the War for Independence.
And the consequences of that war were massive.
Profound and long-lasting. Israel won and significantly expanded its territory beyond the UN partition lines.
And the Palestinians?
Around 750,000 Palestinians either fled the fighting or were expelled by Israeli forces. The Nakba, or catastrophe as they call it. And they've never been allowed to return to their homes. To this day, Palestinians still don't have an internationally recognized state.
So Herzl's dream, his prediction, it came true. 51 years later, almost exactly.
It did.
But the reality, born in war, leading to this mass displacement, it couldn't be further from that peaceful vision in Alt-Newland, could it?
Tragically, no. Instead of peaceful integration, it was intense conflict, immense loss of life on both sides, and the seeds of an enduring conflict were sown right there at the beginning.
And after Israel's founding, more Jewish immigration followed.
A huge wave. Hundreds of thousands of Jews came, especially from Middle Eastern and North African countries where their situations became precarious, as well as from Europe. The population almost doubled very quickly.
And Zionism itself continued to change, to evolve, even after the state was established.
Definitely. One key moment highlighted in the sources is the 1967 Six-Day War.
Israel's victory in that war.
It had a huge impact, particularly on religious communities. Many Orthodox Jews who, remember, had largely opposed Zionism before the state.
Right. Waiting for the Messiah.
Exactly. They saw the stunning victory as a divine sign. Maybe God was behind this return. Maybe waiting for the Messiah wasn't necessary anymore in the same way. This really fueled religious nationalism.
And contributed to the rise of right-wing politics.
Significantly. Parties like Likud gained strength, eventually winning the general election for the first time in 1977, breaking decades of labor dominance.
But there was still a left-wing Zionist perspective, too.
Oh, yes. Groups like Meretz, which was part of coalition governments later on in the 80s and 90s, they were still committed to Israel as a Jewish state, but generally showed more empathy towards the Palestinians, advocated for compromise, supported a two-state solution, or even explored ideas of a single state with equal rights for everyone.
So different visions for Israel's future continued within Zionism itself.
Absolutely. And that conflict, which some still refer to as the Zionist War, it just continues. And as the NPR historians mentioned in the source point out, it's crucial to remember that not all Jews today identify as Zionists. It's not a monolithic identity.
We've certainly covered an incredible sweep of history in this deep dive. From that one journalist, Herzl, having that profound realization on a Paris street.
Yeah.
To a global movement, the creation of a nation. The vision for a safe home was realized, but wow, in a way that just diverged so dramatically from how the founder first dreamed it.
It really did. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Consider this paradox. This deep historical quest for safety, for self-determination, born out of centuries of terrible persecution. How did it, in turn, lead to new cycles of displacement, of conflict? What does this incredibly complex history teach us about, perhaps, the unintended consequences that can flow even from noble goals? And about the immense challenge, the still unsolved challenge of forging peace when histories, identities, and claims to the same land are so deeply, painfully intertwined?